The police, driven by racism, brazenly tied a pregnant woman of color to train tracks, leaving her to face death simply because they deemed her unworthy of her place in the world. Yet her extraordinary actions stunned her tormentor, overturning all his cruel calculations. Her journey became not just a fight for survival, but a symbol of courage and strength in the struggle against injustice. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay with us through these riveting, must-hear stories. Amber Hayes, a successful social activist and founder of a renowned organization for social reform, was driving home after a meaningful evening. She had just concluded a speech at a charity event aimed at raising funds to support families suffering from police injustice. Her black SUV glided smoothly along the deserted road, the headlights illuminating rows of empress trees swaying in the cool night breeze. Amber gently rested her hand on her belly, feeling the movement of the child within. 7 months had passed, and she couldn't help but feel a blend of happiness and anticipation for a better future. In her mind, the image of her child stood as a symbol of hope and the change she had devoted her life to fighting for. No matter her successes, Amber could never forget her past. She had grown up in a poor neighborhood where the sight of a police car evoked only fear. Amber recalled the times when her father, a calm and loving man, was harassed and beaten by police solely because of his skin color. Those memories had ignited a fire within her, driving her to study law and later become an ardent activist, tirelessly fighting to reform the system. Despite her achievements, Amber knew the battle was far from over. That night's event was a step forward, but she understood that real change required much more. She never allowed herself to fully relax, always feeling the shadow of injustice looming, not only over her but also over the community she cherished and fought to protect. Soft jazz music played from the car speakers, blending with the hum of the engine, offering a moment of peace on her journey home. Amber glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 10:47 p.m. Not too late, but late enough for the road to be quiet. A trace of fatigue from the long day crept in, but she quickly shook it off, focusing on the road. Just a few more weeks, Amber whispered to herself, a gentle smile forming as her baby kicked lightly. For her, motherhood was not only a responsibility but also an opportunity to sow the seeds of hope in a chaotic world. Yet, even in this peaceful moment, Amber could not completely forget the dangers she faced. As a black woman speaking out against injustice, she'd received her share of threats and hatred. She knew that to some, her success was not an inspiration but a challenge to the traditional power structures. But Amber never let fear control her. For her, justice was the highest goal, and she was willing to do whatever it took to achieve it. The SUV continued forward, its headlights cutting through the still night. Amber felt her heart calm as she thought of the warm home awaiting her. She didn't know that in just a few minutes her life would change forever. A monumental challenge was about to descend upon her, a challenge not just of survival but of defending the dream of justice she had pursued all her life. Amber Hayes drove along a narrow road, the headlights piercing through the dense darkness. She could feel the stillness around her, a rare quiet after a long day. But when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror, her peace quickly dissipated. Amber frowned, wondering why a police car had its lights flashing behind her. She had been driving within the speed limit, her vehicle was fully registered, and there was no apparent reason to be stopped. Nonetheless, she calmly slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. Taking a deep breath, she tried to steady herself as the flashing lights drew closer. This wasn't her first encounter with the police, and she knew this interaction might not be straightforward. The patrol car stopped directly behind her SUV, its flickering lights casting shadows on the rows of trees lining the road. Amber glanced into the rearview mirror and saw two figures step out of the car. They were in uniform, walking leisurely, but their demeanor exuded arrogance. One was tall, with cold eyes and a name tag reading Patrick Hale on his chest. The other, Victor Rivers, was shorter, appearing somewhat hesitant but following Patrick with clear subservience. Amber rolled down her car window as they approached. She chose to maintain a polite demeanor, though her vigilance was heightened. "Good evening, officer," she said, her tone calm yet assertive. "How can I assist you?" Patrick didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned against the car door, his gaze sweeping over Amber with blatant disdain. "License and registration," he ordered coldly. Amber reached slowly toward the glove compartment, her movements deliberate to avoid any misinterpretation. "I'm retrieving my documents now," she said, keeping her eyes fixed on Patrick. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Patrick smirked, a mocking smile tugging at his lips. "We received a report about a suspicious person in this area," he replied, but offered no further details. "You seem out of place here." Amber immediately caught the racist undertone in his words. Her heart tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I'm driving home," she responded, her voice steady. "I don't believe driving in this area is a crime." Victor, standing behind Patrick, glanced at Amber with evident unease. "It's just a routine check, ma'am," he said softly, his voice lacking confidence. But his eyes avoided hers when she looked directly at him. Patrick took the documents from Amber's hand, glancing at them carelessly before handing them back without thoroughly checking. "Step out of the car," he ordered, his tone sharp. Amber froze. "Excuse me, officer, but what have I done to warrant stepping out of the car?" Patrick squinted, leaning in closer, asserting his authority. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he said menacingly. Victor stood silently beside him, his hand resting near the gun on his hip, his gaze carefully avoiding Amber's. Amber's instincts screamed that this was no ordinary stop. Every fiber of her being warned her that this encounter was veering into dangerous territory. "I don't believe I need to step out of the vehicle unless there's a valid reason," she said, her voice firm. Patrick leaned closer, his expression growing more aggressive. "Who do you think you are? Just because you're some famous activist, you think you're above the law?" He sneered. "You think you can go on TV, spewing garbage about the police and not face consequences?" Anger bubbled within Amber, but she suppressed it. She knew that any emotional reaction would only escalate the situation. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, her eyes locked on Patrick. "If you want to check anything, I'm willing to cooperate, but I don't see why I need to leave my vehicle." Patrick's patience snapped. He yanked the car door open, leaned in, and pulled Amber out with a rough grip. "You don't get to ask questions," he growled, while Victor stood by, unmoving, his reluctance to intervene starkly apparent. Amber was forced to stand by the roadside, the night air biting against her skin. Patrick circled her SUV, pretending to inspect it as if searching for something incriminating. "Anything suspicious in this car? Weapons? Drugs?" he asked mockingly. Amber clenched her teeth. "There's nothing. I haven't broken any laws." Patrick returned, crossing his arms, a smug smirk on his face. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? It's amusing that you believe this system will change because of what you say." Victor finally spoke, but not to defend Amber. "Patrick, we need to move on," he murmured, his voice low, clearly eager to end the situation. Patrick shook his head, his eyes still locked on Amber. "No, we're taking her to the station. Let's see how smart she is when there's no one around to protect her." Amber felt the danger closing in. She knew something terrible was imminent, but she couldn't think of a way to de-escalate the situation. As the officers forced her into the patrol car, a wave of helplessness washed over her. Yet, even in her fear, she resolved not to let them win. Amber was shoved roughly into the back seat of the patrol car, her wrists tightly bound by cold metal handcuffs. The headlights from the car ahead cut through the darkness, but inside, the atmosphere was stifling with tense silence. Patrick Hale, seated behind the wheel, glanced at Amber through the rearview mirror with a triumphant expression. Victor Rivers sat beside him, silent, his face betraying unease. Amber tried to steady her breathing, focusing on assessing the situation. "You have no right to do this," she said, her voice firm. "I've broken no laws. This is an abuse of power." Patrick let out a derisive laugh, the sound dripping with mockery. "Do you think this is a courtroom?" he sneered. "This isn't the place for your lectures on civil rights." Turning to look at Amber directly, his cold smile lingered. "You might be a shining star in the media, but here, you're just an arrogant black woman who thinks she's above the law." Patrick's words cut deep into Amber's pride, but she refused to let her anger cloud her judgment. "I know what you're doing," she replied, her tone as calm as she could manage. "And I won't stay silent. Your actions will be exposed." Victor shifted slightly, casting a glance back at Amber over his shoulder. There was a fleeting moment of hesitation in his eyes. "Patrick, maybe we should—" Victor began, but Patrick cut him off sharply. "Shut up, Rivers," Patrick snapped, his voice icy. "What are you afraid of? A pregnant woman. Remember, we're the ones in charge here." Victor fell silent, his gaze dropping to the window. The tension in his body was unmistakable, but he said nothing further, clearly caught in the toxic dynamic of Patrick's authority. Amber sat in the back, fully aware of Patrick's motivations. This wasn't just a typical abuse of power, it was a blatant display of racially motivated hatred. She understood that Patrick wasn't just trying to intimidate her. He wanted to humiliate her, to extinguish any hope she had of challenging the system he represented. The patrol car veered off the main road, turning onto a narrow, unpaved path enveloped in darkness. The surroundings grew increasingly desolate, devoid of house lights or street lamps. Fear began creeping into Amber's mind, but she reminded herself not to show it. Any sign of weakness would only embolden Patrick. "Where are you taking me?" Amber demanded, her voice tinged with suspicion. "I have a right to know why I'm being detained." Patrick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he accelerated, the patrol car jolting over the uneven dirt road. After a moment, he finally spoke, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We're just taking a little drive. Give you some time to think about what happens when you provoke the wrong people." Victor glanced at Patrick, seeming to consider speaking again, but ultimately staying silent. Amber caught the hesitation in his eyes. He was uncomfortable with what was happening, but his silence made him complicit. That realization only fueled Amber's simmering anger. The car came to a stop in a remote, desolate area. There were no lights, no sounds except for the wind whistling through the trees. Patrick stepped out of the car, opened the back door, and yanked Amber out with force. "This will be where you learn to keep quiet," he said, his smile full of menace. Amber couldn't hold back any more. "Your actions will be brought to light," she said coldly. "You may think you're untouchable, but justice will catch up to you." Patrick leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "Justice?" he scoffed. "Justice is what I decide it is, not you. And no one will believe you." Amber stared directly into Patrick's eyes, her gaze blazing with defiance. Yet, deep inside, she knew this was one of the gravest challenges she had ever faced. Victor stood a few steps back, his hands trembling. "Patrick, we don't have to do this," he said, his voice showing the first signs of resistance. Patrick turned sharply toward Victor, his eyes cold and unforgiving. "Getting soft, are you? This is how we maintain order. If you're not on board, go sit in the car." Victor remained silent, and in that silence he made his choice. Amber understood then that she couldn't rely on either of them to help her. She was alone, with only her resolve and faith in the justice she had always fought for. The patrol car reversed and drove away, leaving Amber in the middle of the night, beginning a survival journey no one could have foreseen. The patrol car continued speeding down the dark dirt road, leaving behind the lights of the main streets and any sign of life. Amber Hayes, her hands bound tightly behind her, tried to stay calm as fear wrapped itself around her. Every instinct warned her that this wasn't just a routine abuse of power. This was something darker and more malicious. Patrick Hale drove with cold confidence, his eyes glinting with unmistakable hatred. In his mind, he replayed the image of Amber testifying at a hearing 3 years ago. Her powerful testimony had cost Patrick his authority over a wealthy district, a position that had brought him substantial personal benefits. "She thinks she's a hero," Patrick muttered to Victor, contempt dripping from his voice. "All because she knows how to talk. She destroyed my career." Victor sat silently beside him, but his unease was palpable. He recalled the first time he had seen Patrick beat a young black man in the middle of the street. Back then, Victor had been a rookie, ready to speak up but ultimately silenced by the fear of losing his first job. That memory now resurfaced, gnawing at his conscience. "Patrick, are you sure about this?" Victor asked, his voice shrinking. "We can't keep doing this." Patrick turned, his cold gaze sharp. "What are you thinking, Rivers? If we don't crack down hard, they'll never know their place. Can't you see she's challenging us?" Victor fell silent, conflict churning inside him. Instead of speaking out, he lowered his head, letting Patrick continue. Amber said nothing, but her eyes remained fixed on the rearview mirror. Her silence seemed to provoke Patrick further. "Do you know how many times this has happened?" He pressed, a cruel smile curling his lips. "Your community is full of people who think they can defy the law, and then they learn their lesson." Victor's brow furrowed, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. "Patrick, is this really necessary?" he asked, his voice low and uncertain. Patrick scoffed, shaking his head as if speaking to a naive child. "What do you think, Rivers? This is how we maintain control. If we don't act decisively, we lose power." Amber saw through Patrick's actions. This wasn't about power alone. It was raw hatred, fueled by a system that allowed him to act without consequence. The car came to a sudden stop in a desolate area, where faint moonlight illuminated rusted train tracks and overgrown weeds. Patrick stepped out first, yanked open the back door, and dragged Amber out roughly. The brutality of his movement threw her off balance, but she steadied herself, her gaze unwavering. Patrick looked her up and down as if calculating his next move. "Hayes," he said, his voice disturbingly calm, "you're going to be a lesson for others in your community. We have to keep things in order." Victor stood back, refusing to participate but making no effort to intervene. "Patrick, we don't need to do this," he repeated, but his voice was weak, lacking conviction. Patrick turned sharply, his eyes cold. "If you don't want to be part of this, Rivers, go sit in the car and wait. But if you're not willing to do this, you don't deserve to wear the uniform." Victor stayed silent, his hand clenched near his holstered gun, but he said nothing more. Amber knew she couldn't count on him for help. Patrick dragged Amber toward the tracks, tying her tightly to them with rough ropes. The cords bit into her skin, the pain sharp and unrelenting. The cold night wind swept through the area, but it was nothing compared to the icy malice in Patrick's eyes. "You think you're special, don't you?" Patrick sneered as he looked down at Amber, now lying on the tracks. "No one's going to find you here, and if they do, it'll be too late." Amber stared directly at him, refusing to let fear consume her. "You think you're untouchable, but justice will find you. If not for me, then for others." Patrick smirked, shaking his head mockingly. "Justice? Justice isn't for people like you. It's what we decide it is." He turned away, signaling Victor to return to the car. As they drove off, Amber was left alone in the darkness, a crushing sense of isolation and despair pressing down on her. Yet, even in that moment, she knew she couldn't give up. Amber closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe steadily and focus. She recalled her childhood when her father taught her how to untie knots during their fishing trips. He would always say, "You need to know how to solve problems even when there seems to be no way out." That lesson now shone like a beacon in her mind. With determination and grit, Amber began twisting her wrists, feeling for the knots, searching for any weakness. Each time the ropes dug into her skin, she thought of the child growing inside her, the greatest motivation to keep fighting. She wasn't just fighting for herself, but for her unborn child, for a future free of such injustices. In the still night, the distant echo of a train's whistle reached her ears. It was a stark reminder that her time was running out. But Amber didn't stop. With every ounce of strength she had left, she pulled and twisted until the ropes began to loosen. She knew that if she survived this night, she wouldn't just live. She would fight harder than ever before. Amber Hayes lay on the frigid train tracks, the rough ropes cutting into her wrists and ankles. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, her body aching. But her mind held on to one thought. "I must survive. I cannot give up." The distant rumble of a train engine echoed, its steady rhythm growing louder, a relentless reminder that her time was running out. The wind picked up, carrying the biting chill of the late night. Amber closed her eyes, trying to focus. A memory of her father surfaced, recalling childhood fishing trips when he taught her how to untie knots. Her father, a calm yet strong man, had always told her, "You have to be patient. Every knot has a weakness. You just have to find it." The train grew closer, its whistle piercing the stillness, tearing through the silence. Amber could feel the ground vibrating, the steady tremor resonating through the tracks beneath her back. Fear threatened to consume her, but she pushed it away, channeling every ounce of her strength into her hands. With sheer determination, Amber twisted her wrists, feeling for any give in the ropes. The searing pain from the cords biting into her skin made her wince, but she didn't stop. She remembered her father's advice. The tighter the rope, the more finesse you need. Don't use brute strength. Use precision. She felt a slight looseness. This is it, Amber thought, her breathing quickening. Carefully, she twisted her wrists again, using her fingernails to find the weak point in the knot. Cold sweat broke out on her brow, but she refused to let fear take over. The train's whistle blared louder. It was close now, its headlights illuminating the tracks in the distance, casting Amber's shadow eerily against the ground. Yet, in that moment, she refused to be paralyzed by terror. Just a little more. With a final decisive twist of her wrists, the rope around her hands gave way. Amber felt her hands free for the first time in hours, but she didn't waste a second. She quickly bent forward to untie the ropes around her ankles. her fingers trembling from the cold and tension. The ropes seemed to resist, but Amber knew she had no other choice. The train's headlights bore down on her, the screech of metal on tracks ripping through the air. Amber tugged the rope one last time, feeling it slip from her ankles. Without hesitation, she rolled off the tracks, her body crashing hard onto the gravel beside them. Before she could catch her breath, the train thundered past at a terrifying speed, the wind and noise engulfing her. The force kicked up dirt and leaves, pelting her as she lay motionless. Her breathing was heavy, her body racked with pain, but a wave of relief washed over her. I'm alive. As the train sped away, Amber forced herself to sit up, every muscle in her body protesting. Her wrists were deeply cut, blood oozing from the wounds left by the ropes. Her knees and elbows were bruised, but she paid them no mind. As long as I'm alive, there's hope, she told herself, placing a hand gently over her stomach. The baby was safe. She felt a faint kick from within. Amber's eyes fell on the tracks where she had just escaped death. It was a stark reminder of what she had endured and a symbol of the long fight ahead. Patrick and Victor had chosen the wrong person. I won't let them do this to anyone else. Summoning the last of her strength, Amber stood, every step a battle against the pain coursing through her body. But she didn't stop. In the distance, she spotted the headlights of an approaching car. It could be her chance to get help, or a new danger. She had no choice but to take the risk. With trembling hands, Amber waved, her voice hoarse as she called out, "Help me! Please!" The car's lights drew closer, hope and fear warring within her. One thing was certain in Amber's mind. She had escaped death tonight, and she would not let Patrick and Victor evade justice. Amber staggered on the dirt road, her bloodied hand feebly raised to wave down the approaching car. The headlights shone directly at her, forcing her to squint. The engine noise softened as the car slowed and came to a stop just a few steps away. The door swung open, and a young man stepped out, his expression cautious but curious. "Are you okay?" he asked, his deep voice tinged with wariness. The man, in his late 20s, wore a gray hoodie and jeans. He was lean but quick on his feet. His gaze traveled over Amber, stopping at the wounds on her wrists and the way she clutched her stomach. Amber drew a deep breath, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Please, help me. I just escaped an attack. The police, they tried to kill me." The man's eyes widened in disbelief. "The police?" he repeated as if struggling to process her words. But as he took in her disheveled state and the blood seeping from her injuries, he couldn't look away. "My name is Amber Hayes," she said, her voice broken, each word a struggle. "They kidnapped me, tied me to train tracks. I'm pregnant. Please, I need to get to a hospital." The man, Lucas Carter, hesitated for a moment. The initial caution in his eyes gave way to genuine concern. "Are you telling the truth?" he asked, though his gaze had already softened, his instincts telling him this woman needed help. Amber nodded weakly, one hand resting on her belly, the other gripping the car door for balance. "Please, I'm running out of time," she said, her voice cracking. Lucas studied her for another moment as if making up his mind. Finally, he exhaled sharply and helped her into the passenger seat. "I'll get you to a hospital," he said firmly. "Sit tight. I'll drive as fast as I can." The car sped down the dirt road, Lucas glancing at Amber now and then, his face a mixture of tension and resolve. "I'm Lucas Carter," he said, introducing himself as he tried to keep her alert. "You said the police did this to you? How?" Amber interrupted, recounting the ordeal in short, pained bursts. Her words were heavy with both agony and fury as she described Patrick Hale and Victor Rivers, how they had stopped her, tied her up, and left her on the train tracks to die. When she finished, Lucas was silent for a moment, his expression darkening. "That's horrific," he finally said, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I didn't think something like this could happen. But I believe you. We'll get you to the hospital, and I won't let this be swept under the rug." Amber could feel the sincerity in his words, and she nodded faintly. For the first time since the attack, a small flicker of hope sparked within her. At the hospital, Amber was quickly surrounded by doctors and nurses who tended to her wounds. The fluorescent lights overhead illuminated the room, creating a faint sense of safety. Lying on the bed, Amber felt exhausted but relieved to know she and her baby were out of immediate danger. The door burst open, and Eric, her husband, rushed in. His face was a mix of worry and anger. "Amber!" he exclaimed, hurrying to her bedside and grabbing her hand. "What happened? How did you end up like this?" Amber didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at Eric, her eyes filled with both fatigue and determination. "They tried to kill me, Eric," she said, her voice raspy. "They're not just bad cops, they're murderers, and I won't let them get away with it." Eric squeezed her hand tightly, his eyes darkening with resolve. "I won't let this be silenced," he said, his voice low and firm. "They've gone too far. We'll fight this to the end." Lucas stood in the doorway, his expression one of respect as he watched Amber. "I'll help you," he said, stepping forward. "I don't know what I can do, but I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't get buried." Amber looked at the two men in front of her, her husband, who had stood by her in every battle, and the stranger willing to fight for justice. She felt their strength bolstering her own, and her determination grew even stronger. They had picked the wrong person to attack. Amber Hayes would not stay silent. Amber lay on the hospital bed, her body still aching, but her mind was clear and ready for the next steps. Eric sat beside her, his hand gripping hers tightly, his eyes filled with determination. Lucas stood near the door, like an unintentional but fervent bodyguard. In the quiet atmosphere of the room, a plan began to take shape. "We can't let them get away with this," Amber said, her voice steadier than before. "Patrick and Victor think no one can touch them, but this time will be different. I'm going to expose everything." Eric nodded. "We need evidence, not just your testimony, but undeniable proof." As soon as Amber was discharged, her team set to work. Eric contacted Naomi Green, a renowned human rights attorney with extensive experience handling cases of police abuse. Naomi arrived with a confident demeanor, a sharp suit, and a thick folder in her hands. "Amber," she said, her gaze piercing, "your story is a textbook example of systemic rot. We'll do everything we can to bring them to justice." Lucas, though unfamiliar with these kinds of efforts, didn't hesitate to get involved. He suggested returning to the area near the train tracks to look for clues. "I remember a gas station not far from there," Lucas said. "Maybe the surveillance cameras caught something." Amber and Eric agreed, and Lucas immediately sprang into action. He drove to the gas station, pretending to shop while inquiring about the security cameras. At first, the manager was hesitant, but when Lucas explained that it was part of a serious investigation, he agreed to help. Reviewing footage from the night of Amber's abduction, Lucas found a crucial piece of evidence. The patrol car, driven by Patrick and Victor, appeared on the screen, speeding toward the train tracks. The license plate and timestamp aligned perfectly with Amber's account. Lucas copied the footage onto a USB drive and brought it back. "This is it," Lucas said, placing the USB on the table in front of Naomi. "They can't deny this." Naomi reviewed the footage, nodding in satisfaction. "This is an important piece of the puzzle, but we need more. Do they have a history? Are there other victims who can testify? Amber focused on the most concrete evidence, like the surveillance footage from the gas station showing Patrick and Victor's patrol car. A witness, Elijah, came forward, providing testimony about being assaulted and threatened by the same two officers. These pieces of evidence formed the foundation of their case. Over the next few days, Amber's team gathered additional proof. Naomi worked tirelessly to build the case, combining Amber's testimony, the video evidence from Lucas, and statements from Elijah and other victims. They uncovered a long history of abuse by Patrick and Victor, who had been shielded by the system, allowing them to avoid accountability. We're painting a clear picture of how they've been abusing their power, Naomi said, placing a thick stack of documents on the table. This isn't just about Amber's attack. This is a pattern of corruption. Amber felt hope steadily growing within her. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her community, for Elijah, and others like him. But she also knew that Patrick and Victor wouldn't give up easily. Patrick Hale and Victor Rivers sat in their patrol car, the red flashing lights from the dashboard casting tense shadows on their faces. News had reached them that Amber Hayes was still alive and had begun taking steps to expose the truth. Patrick, gripping the steering wheel tightly, clenched his jaw, his eyes blazing with fury. "We need to end this now," Patrick said, his voice hissing through gritted teeth. "If she keeps going, it's not just us. This whole system will be dragged down." Victor, sitting in the passenger seat, wiped the sweat from his forehead. "What are you thinking, Patrick? Threaten her, or something more extreme?" Patrick smirked coldly, the kind of smile that sent a chill down the spine. "She thinks she's untouchable because she has a few supporters, but we have ways to shut her up. This time, there won't be any second chances." Meanwhile, Amber and her team continued gathering evidence, unaware that Patrick and Victor were closely monitoring their every move. One morning, as Amber checked her phone, she saw a message from an unknown number. "Give it up, Hayes. Next time, you won't be so lucky." A shiver ran down Amber's spine, but she quickly steadied herself. "They're trying to scare me," she said to Eric, handing him the phone. "But this only proves we're on the right track." Eric frowned, his eyes filled with concern. "Amber, this isn't just about justice anymore. It's about your life and our child's. We need to be careful." But the threats didn't stop there. Late one night, while Amber was working at her desk, a loud crash echoed from the front of the house. She and Eric rushed into the living room to find a shattered window and a brick lying on the floor with a note attached. "This is just a warning. Back off now." Eric pulled Amber away from the window, his expression blazing with anger. "That's it. I won't let you or our family be threatened anymore." The next morning, Eric contacted a private security firm and hired a team of professionals to protect their family. Surveillance cameras were installed around the house, and a bodyguard was assigned to accompany Amber whenever she left home. "You have to promise me you'll be careful," Eric said, his tone serious. "We don't know how far Patrick and Victor are willing to go." Amber took his hand, her gaze resolute. "I'll be careful, but I won't stop. If we give in to fear and stay silent, they win. I can't let that happen." Amber knew that to protect herself and bring the truth to light, she needed the media's help. She reached out to Charlotte Lee, a well-known investigative journalist famed for exposing corruption and abuse of power within law enforcement. Charlotte, with her sharp eyes and edgy short hair, arrived at Amber's house with a recorder and a thick notebook in hand. "Amber Hayes," Charlotte said, offering a warm but determined smile. "Your story is already spreading, but I want to hear the whole truth from you. I promise to bring this to the public." Amber sat across from Charlotte and recounted every detail, from being stopped on the road and tied to the train tracks to the recent threats. Charlotte listened intently, her focus unwavering, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. When Amber finished, she looked directly at Charlotte. "They think I'll be scared into silence," Amber said firmly. "But I won't let them do this to anyone else. I need your help to expose the truth." Charlotte nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. "I'll write the story, Amber, but you need to prepare yourself. Once this goes public, they'll come at you from every angle, not just legally but personally." Amber clenched her hands, her expression unshaken. "I'm ready. We can't let fear control us." Within days, Charlotte's article was published in a major newspaper under the headline, "Abusers in Uniform: The Story of Amber Hayes." The piece detailed the attack, featuring the gas station surveillance video, testimony from other victims, and evidence of the recent threats Amber had received. Public response was swift and overwhelming. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForAmber and #StopPoliceAbuse quickly trended. Heated discussions erupted across platforms with widespread outrage directed at Patrick, Victor, and the police system that had protected them. Patrick read the article, clutching the newspaper so tightly that it crumpled in his hands. "She'll regret this," he growled, his voice dripping with malice. "Are you with me on this, Rivers?" Victor remained silent, but deep inside, he knew that things were spiraling out of control. The courtroom was packed that day. Light streamed through the large windows, but it wasn't enough to dispel the tension that filled the room. Amber Hayes entered the courtroom, her gaze steady, though her exhaustion from days of relentless fighting was evident. Beside her stood Eric, Lucas, Elijah, and attorney Naomi Green, each radiating a fierce determination. On the other side of the room, Patrick Hale sat with his team of lawyers, his expression cool and unbothered. Dressed sharply in a suit, his cold eyes and smirking lips radiated defiance. Sitting a bit apart from him was Victor Rivers, looking uneasy and tense. Gone was his previous arrogance. His eyes darted nervously, avoiding contact. Attorney Naomi Green was the first to address the court. Standing confidently, her presence commanding the room, she spoke with conviction and gravity. Naomi detailed how Patrick and Victor had abused their power to detain Amber, transport her to the train tracks, and deliberately endanger her life. She argued that this wasn't merely a case of personal misconduct, but a glaring example of systemic injustice within the police force. "We are not just speaking about Amber Hayes," Naomi concluded. "We are speaking about a system that enables individuals like Patrick Hale and Victor Rivers to act without consequence. But today, we will change that." Naomi presented key evidence, the gas station surveillance footage, and the testimony of Elijah, a witness who had been unjustly attacked by Patrick and Victor. The evidence painted a clear picture of abuse of power and directly linked the defendants to the incident. "They told me to know my place," Elijah said, his eyes glistening with tears, "and I think that says it all." When it was Patrick Hale's turn, he took the stand with arrogant confidence. His lawyers attempted to paint him as a dedicated officer merely doing his job. Patrick claimed that Amber had fabricated the story, leveraging her public persona to smear him and the police force. "She's an activist," Patrick said, his tone calm but dripping with sarcasm. "She's used to manipulating the media to serve her agenda. This is just another one of her stunts." Patrick even insinuated that Amber's injuries might have been self-inflicted, causing a murmur of disbelief to ripple through the courtroom. However, his confidence began to falter, when Naomi stood to counter his claims, presenting the irrefutable evidence her team had gathered. The mounting pressure from public scrutiny and the damning evidence eventually broke Victor Rivers. Sitting on the witness stand, he looked as though the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He hung his head, his voice trembling as he began to speak. Patrick. He was always the one calling the shots. But I can't deny that I stood there and did nothing. Why? Because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I spoke up, I'd lose everything. Victor paused, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. But I also remember one time, back when I was a rookie officer, I saw Patrick beating an innocent man just because he didn't pull over fast enough. I wanted to speak out then, but I didn't have the courage. That silence cost me my integrity, and now I'm paying the price. Victor looked directly at the jury, his eyes filled with regret. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want this to end. I don't want anyone else to suffer what Amber has endured. Victor's confession cast a heavy pall over the courtroom. For the first time during the trial, Patrick lost his usual air of confidence. He glared at Victor with undisguised fury, but there was nothing he could do to stop his former colleague's testimony. When Naomi stepped up to deliver her closing arguments, she addressed the jury with unwavering intensity. "What we've seen here today is not just a personal case," she said. "This is about a system that needs to change." Patrick Hale abused his power to harm Amber Hayes and many others. But today, we have the chance to say, enough. Amber, seated at her table, felt a surge of solidarity from those around her. She knew the battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, they had taken a significant step forward. The courtroom was so silent that the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. The jury returned after hours of deliberation. Their faces were serious, betraying no emotion, but the tension in the room was palpable. Amber Hayes sat between Eric and Naomi, her hands clasped tightly together under the table. She could feel every beat of her heart pounding as if it might burst from her chest. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked, her voice steady, carrying the weight of the moment. The foreperson, an elderly woman with silvery hair, stood up holding the verdict slip in her hands. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." All eyes turned to the foreperson. She took a deep breath and began to read. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendants, Patrick Hale and Victor Rivers, guilty. Amber felt a surge of energy floods her body. The murmurs in the courtroom fell silent, leaving only the ringing of the verdict echoing through the air. On the charge of abuse of power, guilty. On the charge of racial discrimination, guilty. These words rang like bells, shattering the wall of impunity Patrick had always believed protected him. Beside Amber, Eric exhaled deeply, while Naomi smiled faintly, satisfaction evident in her expression. Patrick Hale, seated a few steps away, could no longer maintain his arrogant composure. His face paled, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly it seemed as if he wanted to break it. Victor Rivers kept his head down, unable to meet anyone's gaze, his shame etched deeply into his posture. The judge proceeded to deliver the sentence. "For the crimes for which you have been convicted, Patrick Hale is sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Victor Rivers, for his cooperation and confession, is sentenced to 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 10 years. Both are stripped of all rights and titles associated with the police force." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and whispers. Amber's supporters clapped, tears streaming down many faces. Elijah, seated in the gallery, quietly wiped his tears, feeling justice he never thought possible. Patrick sprang from his chair, his face flushed with rage. "The system will protect me," he shouted, his voice echoing throughout the room. "You'll all regret this. Don't you understand that I'm part of it?" His defiant declaration only deepened the disgust of those in the room, but Amber remained calm, her gaze steady as she looked directly at him. She didn't need to say a word. Her silence was the clearest answer. The system had failed to shield him this time, and justice had prevailed. Patrick was escorted out of the courtroom by 2 other officers, still shouting, but his words were now hollow. Victor, on the other hand, left quietly, accepting his fate without resistance. As the trial concluded, Amber stepped out of the courtroom, sunlight streaming through the large windows. Outside, a crowd had gathered, holding signs and chanting, "Justice for Amber! Justice for all!" Amber paused at the top of the steps leading down, her eyes scanning the crowd. A young black girl stood near the front, holding her mother's hand, her eyes wide with admiration and hope as she looked at Amber. The sight caused Amber's throat to tighten, but she suppressed the emotion. She knew this fight was not just for her. It was for all those who lacked a voice in an unjust system. Eric joined her, placing a gentle hand on her back. "You did it," he said, his voice low but filled with pride. Amber nodded slightly, her gaze still fixed ahead. "We did it," she replied. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The system needed to change, and she wouldn't stop until that became a reality. Morning light poured into the small room where Amber Hayes was preparing her first speech since the trial. Today, she wasn't just a survivor, she was a leader, a symbol of the nationwide police reform movement that was gaining momentum. Eric stood beside her, helping organize her notes. "You've done something most people wouldn't even dare to dream of," he said, pride shining in his eyes. Amber smiled, but her expression carried more determination and a sense of responsibility than joy. "This is just the beginning," she replied firmly. "There's so much more to do." Amber had become the face of the police reform movement, using the influence of her trial to drive national conversations. However, not everyone supported her. Articles and social media posts criticized her efforts, some accusing her of undermining trust in law enforcement. "She's just trying to make herself famous," one anonymous post claimed, presenting Amber with challenges greater than ever. But none of this deterred Amber. She continued advocating for concrete changes, independent oversight, police training reform, and rebuilding trust between law enforcement and communities. Her efforts sparked spirited discussions nationwide, and some meaningful reforms began to take shape. At a community meeting, a middle-aged woman approached Amber, her eyes red with tears. "Thank you," she said. "I lost my son to this injustice, but because of you I feel his death wasn't in vain." Her words moved Amber deeply, reminding her that her fight was not just about changing the system, but also about healing the wounds it had caused. Amber also gained support from youth organizations. A group of young people in Chicago sent her a video of their public forum on police reform. "We've learned from you that silence is complicity," one of them said in the video, "and we won't stay silent anymore." At a major conference in Washington, Amber stood before hundreds of attendees, including policymakers, activists, and members of the public. "We cannot change a system without acknowledging that it has failed far too many people," she said, her powerful voice echoing through the room. "Justice is not just an outcome. It must be the foundation of every decision, every action." Her words not only inspired, but also spurred action. Communities across the country began organizing meetings, demanding transparency and accountability from local police forces. Soon, Amber started receiving invitations from youth groups and schools to share her story and experiences. One day, she visited a community center in an area previously labeled a hot spot for racial discrimination and police violence. In a crowded room, Amber stood before a group of young people, their eyes filled with curiosity and a yearning for change. A boy, about 16 years old, with skeptical eyes, stood and asked, "How do you stop being afraid? Aren't you scared they'll come after you again?" Amber paused, meeting his gaze. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice low but steady. "But if we let fear control us, then the wrongdoers win. I've learned to turn fear into strength, and so can you." Her words left the room silent for a moment before applause erupted, long and thunderous. After the talk, many young people approached Amber, sharing their stories and expressing their desire to join the movement. Amber also made time to meet with children in areas where fear of the police was deeply ingrained. One morning, she visited an elementary school, entering a classroom where young children sat quietly, their eyes wary when she mentioned the police. She shared her story, but this time she focused on hope. "Change is possible," she said, crouching to meet the eyes of a small girl with big, curious eyes. "We can build a world where you don't have to be afraid. But it starts with you believing that you deserve justice and respect." The little girl looked at Amber, her eyes glistening with tears, and then nodded. Amber knew that this seemingly small moment was the beginning of lasting change. Amber also connected with young community leaders, those who had started local movements but lacked resources and experience. At a community meeting in a local church, where most residents had previously been afraid to speak out for fear of retaliation, Amber met Mrs. Linda, a middle-aged woman who had once opposed reform efforts. After the meeting, Mrs. Linda approached Amber, her emotions evident. "Ms. Hayes," she said, her voice trembling, "I used to think people like you were just looking for fame. But when I saw you stand up despite everything, I realized you're fighting not just for yourself, but for us too. Thank you for giving me hope." Amber took Mrs. Linda's hand, her gaze soft yet resolute. "I'm just one of many, trying to make a difference," Amber said. "And if we stand together, we can change everything." From that moment, Mrs. Linda and many others began participating in community discussions, showing stronger support for Amber's movement. "None of us can do this alone," Amber said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "We need each other. And you must remember that every action, no matter how small, holds power when done with faith and determination." A young activist, a woman named Jasmine, stepped forward after the talk and said, "You're the reason I started fighting for justice. I always thought we didn't have a chance, but now I know I was wrong." Amber placed a hand on Jasmine's shoulder and smiled with hope. "We never fight alone," she said, "and you will be the one to carry this movement even further." The movement Amber led didn't stop at small, local communities. The voices she had inspired spread across the nation, sparking national discussions about police reform. New legislation was proposed, mandatory training programs implemented, and independent oversight mechanisms began to be tested. Amber knew the road ahead was still long, but she remained undaunted. "Every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to a truly just system," she said during a televised interview, "and I won't stop until that becomes a reality." During the final months of her pregnancy, Amber Hayes reduced her demanding schedule to focus on her health and the arrival of her child. However, she never abandoned the movement she had led, continuing to attend online meetings and remotely support communities implementing reforms. "This isn't just my fight," she told Eric one evening. "This is about our child's future." The days of waiting for the baby's arrival passed in a mix of anticipation and calm. One early spring evening, as the sunset painted the sky with a rosy glow, Amber felt the first pains of labor. Eric immediately drove her to the hospital, his hand never leaving hers during the journey. After hours of pain and hope, Amber Hayes gave birth to a healthy baby boy. When the nurse placed the baby in her arms, Amber gazed at his tiny face, tears shimmering in her tired but joyful eyes. "Welcome to the world, Elijah," she whispered, the name a promise for the future she would dedicate her life to protecting and building. Eric sat beside her, watching his wife and son with pride and love. "Elijah," he repeated softly, "a meaningful name. It will always remind us of what we've overcome and what we're striving for." Amber nodded, her heart filled with resolve. "Our child will grow up in a better world," she said, gently caressing Elijah's tiny cheeks. "And I'll do everything to make that a reality." Elijah's birth didn't diminish Amber's impact on the police reform movement. On the contrary, her journey of survival, struggle, and triumph became an inspiration not only for the Black community, but also for people across the nation seeking justice. The media celebrated Amber as a symbol of change, with headlines such as, "Amber Hayes, the woman redefining American justice." Interviews and articles about her focused not only on Amber's story, but also on the reforms she championed. However, Amber's rising prominence brought danger along with admiration. One night, as she worked in the living room, Eric entered holding a thick envelope delivered to their home with no return address. Inside were close-up photographs of Amber and Elijah, along with an anonymous note that read, "Stop now, or it won't just be you who pays the price." Eric clenched his fists, his eyes burning with anger. "Amber, we need to increase security immediately. This is no longer just a simple threat." Amber looked at the photos, feeling a wave of unease, but she quickly composed herself. "I know they won't stop, but if we let fear hold us back, then they win," she said firmly. On social media, Amber also became the target of smear campaigns by anti-reform groups. Anonymous posts and threatening messages flooded platforms, with some accusing her of profiting from her story. Despite this, Amber remained steadfast. "These attacks only prove that we're making a difference," she told her team. "But we must keep fighting, not just for ourselves but for the generations to come." Not long after, Amber was appointed as the leader of a national police reform initiative, working with lawmakers, non-governmental organizations, and activists to create a more just system. The initiative included bias training programs, independent oversight mechanisms, and reforms in police recruitment and disciplinary procedures. One morning, a few weeks after Elijah's birth, Amber stood by the living room window, cradling her son in her arms. Sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a warm, golden glow over them. Outside, trees were budding, symbolizing renewal and hope. Amber gazed out thoughtfully, her eyes reflecting both contemplation and faith. The road ahead would not be easy, but she no longer felt alone. She had Eric, Elijah, and a community of people ready to fight alongside her. Eric entered the room and stood beside her. "What are you thinking?" he asked gently. Amber smiled softly, turning to look at him. "I'm thinking about the future," she replied, "a future where Elijah will grow up, where justice isn't just a distant dream but a reality we all deserve." Eric wrapped his arms around her and their son, a moment of peace amidst the challenges. "We'll build that future together," he said. Amber nodded, her eyes fixed on Elijah, who was peacefully asleep in her arms. "Everything we do, everything we fight for, is for the next generation," she said, "and I believe we'll make it happen." In the morning light, Amber holding Elijah, her gaze resolute and far-reaching, became a symbol of hope and resilience. This wasn't just the end of one story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice, courage, and love would lead the way. The story of Amber Hayes is not just a personal journey, but a beacon of hope for a fairer world. From seemingly insurmountable challenges, Amber rose, becoming a symbol of change and inspiring millions. What are your thoughts on Amber's journey? If you were in her position, how would you confront injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this story with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next video.